Hello and welcome to PMO Virtual Summit, everyone. We have a wonderful guest here today with us,
Sam Yankelevitch. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Hussein, how are you today?
I'm doing good, thanks. How are you?
Good. Thank you for this invitation. I hope I can add value to your members.
I'm sure you will, Sam. I'm sure you will. I'm excited to get our session started. It's on reduce variation caused by language, culture, and distance. It's a mouthful, I have to say, but I know there's a lot behind it, and I'm going to go ahead and let you explain that to the audience. But before I do hand it over to you, I want to make sure everybody knows who you are and what you're going to be bringing to the table.
Perfect.
So, Sam Yankelevitch has helped numerous organizations reduce their struggle with unwanted results caused by miscommunication. He facilitates workshops where he helps align teams in local and international settings. Sam has presented at international conferences and is the author of several books, including Lean Potion Number 9, Communication: The Next Lean Frontier, Walking the Invisible Gamba, and Lean Communication, where he combines over 30 years of global industry and supply chain experience with quality and continuous improvement methodologies. Of course, you can learn more about him at samyankelevitch.com. That's all. That's Sam for you, everyone. Sam, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Hussein. So thank you for joining us today. And as Hussein mentioned, my topic is about reducing variation caused by language, culture, and distance, and especially in these teams that we have today that are outsourced and not always local. I talk about variation based on something that Dr. W.E. Deming said a long time ago. He's quoted as saying, "Uncontrolled variation is the enemy of quality." I talk about that because it has to do with miscommunication. Uncontrolled variation can cause miscommunication. I ask the audience, have you ever tried to coordinate your tasks in your projects without communicating? I think it's pretty much impossible to do because a project really entails having to do things with more than just one person. And the topic of variation, to be clear, and I'll explain a little bit about that later too, but variation is the enemy of stable processes, repeatable processes, predictable processes. And in any project, something that we really want to keep an eye out on is to reduce the variation so that we can really follow our plan, and hopefully things will come out as close as possible to our plan. So I use this quote from George Bernard Shaw. He's a famous Irish playwright, and he stated that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And during my presentation, and this is the work I do is helping organizations recognize this illusion, be very aware of the illusion, and do something about it, because it's that illusion that communication has taken place that drives this variation that this presentation is about. So most of the people that I deal with in my work are technically oriented, either from the IT area, project management area, engineering, quality, and design. And I often find that they are overwhelmed with technical skills. They're very, very intelligent with technical skills. But in this world where we have to interact to get our projects taken care of, and any time somebody's going to be managing a PMO, it's strongly recommended that you complement your technical skill set with people's skills. The reason is that no matter how much technology is out there, and no matter how much you think technology is actually going to solve all your problems, you're still going to be interdependent on people from different walks of life, from different, that have different viewpoints, that understand things different. And you're going to have those people skills in order for your PMO and the projects to be successful in this incredible interdependent world that we're in. So I want to give an example here of what happened with Airbus. I don't know if anybody has flown this beautiful airplane. It's got two levels, an upper level and a lower level. And I always joke that regardless, they invented this airplane to serve bad food at the upper level and the lower level. Well, it really depends on the airline. But jokes aside, the variation created because of the three factors of language, culture, and distance impacted the first prototype airplane. It just didn't take off on time. There was a delay of about 20 months, and it accounted for about a $6.1 billion loss. For me, that's a lot of money. I don't know if there's members of the audience that are very wealthy. I think still $6.1 billion is quite a bit of money, especially when you're losing it. It's really painful. And so as the story goes, this was a project managed centrally by Airbus Industries and EADS. And they had designers and people manufacturing things in all of these locations. They had people in Spain, people in France, Germany, Italy, and as well as in Great Britain. Right there and then, you can suspect that having all of these different cultures, different languages, things were not going to go 100% based on plan because of potential miscommunication issues. In fact, they decided to make English the language of business. And I always tell my audience, really, that's the solution? Well, could you imagine somebody from Germany speaking to somebody from Spain in English when neither of the two are fluent in that language, or they're not, it's not their native tongue? So that in itself was not the solution. Anyways, as you see here, this very complex airplane is made of the fuselage, the cockpit, the engines, the tail, and all of these things had to be manufactured. And inside these fuselage parts, you have all of these wiring systems that wind around these nooks and crannies, one on top of the other, a lot of curvatures that are out there. Now, when they finished putting together the fuselage parts, the tail, the engines, the cockpit, and everything else, they started sending everything down to Toulouse for final assembly. Toulouse is in the southern part of France. This is where the headquarters of Airbus Industries is. And that's where they were going to do the final assembly. Well, the problem is that when they started to put together these fuselage parts and they tried to put these wiring harnesses to connect from one end to the airplane to the other end, they couldn't do it. And this was one of the, let's say, the tip of the iceberg for the reason of that $6.1 billion loss. The reason was that the wires were too short and the connections could not be made between one end of the plane and the other end. And you ask, how could this be? I mean, you're talking about state-of-the-art technology, state-of-the-art engineers, the smartest of the smartest, and still this created quite a situation. And so to explain what happened, and this is, again, the tip of the iceberg. Underlying this were a lot of other issues, but the tip of the iceberg happened because the wiring, it was being designed in Germany, and they were using CATIA 4, which is a CAD-CAM platform for design, very high-level platform, while the French had upgraded to CATIA 5. Now, you would think, CATIA 4, CATIA 5 is about the same, kind of like Windows 7 and Windows 10, but actually it was quite different, especially CATIA 5 had already taken care of some algorithms because they found that they needed to effect some improvements that had occurred from previous problems they had. But at the end of the day, these two were not compatible, and there was miscommunication between the two systems that created that the wiring designs from Germany did not match the physical shapes to go into this into the fuselage geometries. And so a lot of the miscommunication that drove this other miscommunication between systems was created because of the variation in language, culture, and distance between the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Italians, and the British. To be clear, one of the algorithms that the CATIA 5 had was the bend radii calculation, which is what compensates for total distance. If you see at the bottom of your screen there, if you want to cover a total distance between point A and B, there's a certain measurement. And what happened is that with all these curvatures not being taken into consideration, they could not make the connections and ended up creating this situation where people just could not make these things work. It ended up with a lot of rework, a lot of redesign, a lot of waste. And I think 20 months later, finally, the airplane did take off. Unfortunately, things were not done right the first time. So I ask, and how is this relevant to the work that I'm talking about in communication? I ask always, does a plane fly because of its wings, its engines, the pilots, or the hydraulic system? And it's actually, it flies because of interdependent parts working in coordination. And it's not because of one single thing. And coordination, I find, from the definition in the dictionary, it's organizing different stakeholders of a project so that they can work together effectively. I kind of hijacked what was in the dictionary and put the project information in here for PMO success. Now, let's not, I don't want to just talk about the airplane, but there's also forces of nature that have to do with why an airplane flies. And in this case, let's talk about this lift force. Now, it's invisible, but I always hope when I'm flying that this lift force exists, because without it, that plane is just not going to stay up in the air. It's just not going to stay up there. So we need that. It's the same way with communication. It's invisible. You don't see it, but you better hope that communication is happening in your projects. And from the PMO side, that communication is happening between the PMO and all the stakeholders. Because without it, your projects are just simply not going to fly. And that's pretty much what I've seen in a lot of the operations projects and work that I've done. Now, I want to be clear also that although I talk about distanced stakeholders, in this case, people from all of these countries, this can also happen when you have people sitting across from each other inside four walls or just in one country. So these issues of communication are not exclusive to global situations. I just find it that it is a lot easier to pick the extremes and really acknowledge and realize these invisible things when you have these long distances between the stakeholders, because they highlight and underscore the need for improving communication. So in a nutshell, I think communication has come of age. It is indispensable that we as technically oriented people learn how to do this more effectively. Some learning objectives that I'll touch on today is becoming familiar with the three sources: language, culture, and distance. Adopting tools to analyze cause and effect. I'm going to use a fishbone diagram and a 5 why. Learning some countermeasures to offset the negative impact of this variation, and grasping how PMO leadership can improve communication between stakeholders and with the stakeholders, between the PMO office and them as well. To get some vocabulary in here, I'm going to talk about variance and variation. So variance is really a metric. That's how I see variance, as a metric that you can measure. In this case, the variance to the plan for Airbus Industries was $6.1 billion. The causes of the variation, a lot of them were related to communication issues based on differences in culture, languages, and the distances between the stakeholders. And these are factors we usually don't associate with our responsibility as technical leaders. So that's the variance part. So it's about budgets and plans, the expected outcome. That's what the variance is about, the outcome or the result. As I stated at the beginning, you'll want processes that are stable, processes that are repeatable, under control, and that are predictable. That is, these are the things that you're looking for in your projects. And so variation, actually, that's the reason Dr. Deming said it's the enemy, because the variation causes processes to be uncontrolled, unstable, and really doesn't support a whole lot of predictability in the outcomes of your projects. So let's talk about these three sources of variation: distance, culture, and language in this case. And in my book, by the way, and if you would like to adopt this, I don't know if the listeners are familiar with the Bermuda Triangle. I find that in order to learn some of these things and to keep them in top of mind, I put something in my book called the Daikula Triangle, which is the first letters of distance, culture, and language. So you can refer to this as a Daikula Triangle, and this is where a lot of our projects get get lost, just like the ships and the airplanes get lost in these mysterious circumstances in the ocean in this Bermuda Triangle. Now, this distance, culture, and language can happen, like I said, globally, but it could also happen between the quality and the engineering folks, or between finance and project management. So it's not exclusive to global situations, and I think that's important. To recap this idea, we're talking about a lot of interdependence, interactions that have to happen in coordination between the stakeholders and between the PMO and the stakeholders. In order to do that, we really rely on excellent communication. I also want to state and clarify that I'm talking about communication to drive actions and tasks. I get a lot of people saying, well, what about social communication? You know, when you're having dinner with friends and family, or when you're out just to have coffee. Certainly, that is different type of communication, and it's perhaps less demanding. Here, you're looking for outcomes and business outcomes that could cost money. So miscommunication can cost you big bucks, and really, it's not a good thing. So here's an example. When I was managing a German company, I would always go around talking to people and asking them, did the people in Mexico or did the people in Germany understand what we're asking them, what our expectation is? And I would always hear, I told him, or I sent her the email, or we spoke about it on the phone. And, to me, it was like, okay, did communication happen? And we really don't know. I know for sure these messages were sent. Whether communication happened or not, we don't know. And I asked the audience also, what is quality, or what is change, and what is value? And I always get 3 or 4 different answers for each of these from the audience members, which tells me, or tells us, that everybody has a different idea, a different understanding for any of these concepts. And therefore, I say, Houston, we have a problem, because if everybody has a different idea, everybody's going to understand things in a different way. Therefore, I bring this definition of communication. It comes from the same source as the word common. And so we're looking for messages that make common to many. And going back to this situation here, the question is, did we make the idea or thought common? Because if not, then you have the illusion. That's the illusion that was in that famous phrase from George Bernard Shaw about the biggest problem in communication. And that's what the illusion is. Now, I'll assume that most of the audience members are familiar with a mechanical illustration here that tries to explain how communication works. And I'm going to expand on this a little bit. But at the end of the day, you have a sender, and the sender is sending a message in this bubble. And inside this message is meaning A. It's the sender's meaning. He or she sends the message to the receiver, who then interprets that message, and that meaning becomes B. Now, what we're looking for is what happens in this intersection here in the middle, the intersection of this interaction between the sender and the receiver. And I put there in red, I work a lot in quality, usually red means bad. When meaning A and meaning B are not matching, then you have a nonconformance. This is when you have the illusion. That means that the intention of the sender and the interpreted meaning of the receiver are not the same. And this is when you have miscommunication that is going to drive problems in your projects. What usually happens is that if nobody has a dialogue and you really don't compare notes to see if communication really happened, we're going to live off of assumptions. Each of us will understand things differently. And so what's worse than making an assumption? Acting on an assumption, because that's when it's going to cost you money. And that's exactly what happened in the Airbus situation. The French and the Germans both assumed that they were using the same criteria for the total wire length. And as we now know, that was not true. Each of them was making an assumption. So that created a $6.1 billion disaster. So I strongly recommend this. This is out of my book, Walking the Invisible Gemba. I strongly recommend, this is stuff that I tell my audiences and my trainees, always assume out loud, broadcast your assumptions. Assumptions remain in the brain, as you can see here, and we can't read minds. So you want to have that very strong with your team members to assume out loud. bring them out. That's about dialogue. That's about having conversations and asking further questions for clarification. Your teams are going to look like something like this. These are networks of teams that have to get things done, whether these teams are sitting across the Atlantic or across the desk from each other. In this situation where you have in one company, you got marketing, HR, finance, design, tooling, manufacturing, assembly, packaging, shipping, and accounting all inside the four walls. Regardless, you're looking to see what happens in these intersections here that are in the middle, in the gray. That's where you're looking to make sure that you have quality interactions. Quality interactions is where there is no illusion, where you have actually green where A and B match, where meanings A and B match. And that's the topic of interoperability between systems and people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. You have to have that, like we saw with systems, with CATIA, and with people communicating with each other. So this is what we're looking for. We're looking for the green intersection where both meanings are in common. And that's when you have a standard between two or more people and they know exactly what the expectation is from the sender. So if the sender was sending a request or sending an instruction, that instruction or request are going to be completely understood by the receiver, and then execution of the task is going to follow suit, and it's going to be also very done in an effective way. Now, as you well know, communication is not only verbal, it's not only email communication or texts. We also communicate via drawings, specifications. IT systems communicate often, and you have work instructions. And I won't go into each of these, but just imagine writing work instructions that other people need to understand 100%, IT systems that have to interface in order to communicate data between one and the other. And you know very well, the SAPs of the world with other systems don't communicate all the time, and that creates a lot of miscommunication and problems. So we're going to use some tools, cause and effect tools. This is just to change the topic of the Airbus. This is a slightly different project here, a situation where some prototype parts for an automotive company had to be manufactured. I believe it was in China. There was a team in Detroit, Michigan, and there was a team in Germany coordinating these prototype parts. They were supposed to end up at an OEM in Detroit. And so there was a phone call. During the phone call, there was a conversation about those parts being fragile. Therefore, a special box was required. Special traceability label was also part of the expectation set on the team from China. And so the conversation went on for about 40 minutes. They talked about the prototype parts, the packaging specifications, the labeling requirements. And before the call, somebody in Germany asked, hey, did everybody understand what is needed? And a voice came back saying, yes, we did. Of course, if I'm talking about variance, you can assume that something didn't go according to plan. And sure enough, in this case, the meanings did not match. Each person was making an assumption. The Germans, the Americans made the assumption that the Chinese understood, and vice versa, the Chinese understood, they made the assumptions that they understood exactly what was required. And at the end of the day, the package was received, actually was an envelope more than a package. The parts were fragmented, they were all broken. This company lost the project, which was a $20 million project, and that was a pretty bad situation. So there was a root cause analysis done to see what had happened. And that's something that we're going to discuss in next to talk about how this illusion happened. Now, I'm not going to teach you about fishbone diagrams. I'm going to suppose that you know a little bit about this. If you don't, look up fishbone diagrams or Ishikawa diagrams for root cause analysis. The standard is that we use in operations, we would use 6 different contributing factors to a problem. The problem you put in the fish head, the contributing factors you put on the bones. In this case, typically we use people, measurement, methods, materials, environment, and machinery. That's what everybody's trained to do. Now, in my neck of the woods, I always say we need a bigger fish because I do a lot of global training. And so, I say that the shop floor and the situation has really grown with interdependencies that are far away. And inside the bones, I add distance, language, and culture, which are going to affect the outcomes of your project. And so going back to this situation with the parts that came in broken, let's define the problem as broken parts. And I'm just going to focus on language, culture, and distance in this case as the contributing factors to this situation. As far as language goes, I'll just talk about two of these things, but you'll get a copy of this presentation, or those that will get a copy, you can look at all the other ones, and these are just a few of these. Sometimes we fill out these fishbone diagrams with tens of branches. In this case, we have foreign languages, English acronyms, context, and technical. I'm going to talk about English real quick. English is often used as a language of business. Now, we have problems with when people are not up to speed with their English, but also when native English speakers speak and have accents, or they speak too fast. This is a problem. English speakers get very comfortable and they start using idioms. Just before the end of one of the teleconferences that I participated in, somebody from the US said, we need this to be done by tomorrow, so burn the midnight oil if you have to. And, when you say burn the midnight oil, a lot of you might know what it means, but there were people on the phone call that they didn't know. Now, the people in Germany were thinking very technically. They were mostly engineers. And so they were immediately thinking, oh, what specification oil do we need to burn? And, this was kind of funny when they asked it, but it was a serious situation because, this is when people realize that they can be creating a mess with using funny idioms and things. Based on that fishbone, we ran the a 5Y, and why did miscommunication occur? Well, why did it occur? Because not all participants understood the request the same way. Why? Because accent, speed, and idioms were used by the American team. Why? Well, the American team assumed that everybody spoke technical level English. Why did they assume that? Because English is the language of business and people didn't ask, so it was all assumed that it was all clear. Now, this is a summary of a deeper 5Y that we did, but this was just for illustration purposes, that you can use the 5Y also to bring to the surface these invisible things. I also ask that if you are a native English speaker, or if you deal with native English speaker, take responsibility for the level English, the speed, the accents. Take responsibility for being clear, and because you are interdependent with people from other places. Now let's talk about acronyms. Acronyms were invented supposedly to save time. Unfortunately, they create a lot of problems. So if I read this to you, we need the PST of the FR35-4 by tomorrow. Please check in the BR25 for the ND and provide the STP-9A before COB Friday. Okay. Now, if you're not part of the family that knows exactly what each of these acronyms mean, then not too good. So be careful with acronyms. We get very comfortable speaking acronyms with our own group, with our own internal group. So try to avoid acronyms. They don't help build a relationship. They actually alienate people because they make people sound special. They don't save time. Avoid them if you can, and define them clearly for every stakeholder every time that you interact. That's my recommendation for acronyms. Now we have culture here. And again, this is a very big topic. I'm going to delve into it just a little bit for you to understand when you know that you have cultural issues. Of course, if you're going to deal with several countries, especially all the different countries from across the globe, you're going to have cultural misunderstandings. Now, if you hear these things, or if you sense these things from your group, my way is the best way, my way is the right way, or my way is the only way, then you know that you're going to have cultural situations because everybody is pretty much saying that they're stuck on the way that they understand things. Let me explain one of these dimensions. Now, culture is a very fuzzy topic. So there are many ways of explaining these. Some of the ways of explaining culture is by way of dimensions. I have a few dimensions here. One of them is called high-low context. The way to understand this is that people that are low context usually are very quick and very short in the statements. Most of the meaning is attached to the words, whereas in high context cultures, the meanings are attached to the context. This is where you have people that need a whole lot more conversation, a whole lot more clarity and definition in order to understand the meaning of the message. Now, low context and high context also creates problems in the way people understand things. In this case, we have on the left side an American, let's call him Bob, and on the right side, we have Carlos from Mexico. Now, they're establishing an agreement. Bob is asking for a commitment from Carlos. And Carlos listened to the expectation, and he says, yes, I will do it. Now, at that point, Bob is thinking, well, Carlos committed. He's going to get it done. Now, if you stop it right there, you're going to have a situation because maybe that yes didn't really mean yes at all. And 2 weeks later, you might find out that things didn't get done according to what Bob expected. So what's happening in Carlos's mind is that he won't say no because his priority is to ensure that Bob is happy. He doesn't want to make him upset. And he just wants to get, move on. He wants to move on from this situation. And so we have an illusion here, and that's going to create quite a problem. Now, it also happens between departments, between quality and finance, for example. So keep that in mind. Cultural is also not only from the national side, but functionally. They speak different languages, finance and quality, and they think and see things completely different. So let me ask you if things get better when people are not face-to-face. In this slide here, going back, Carlos and Bob were face-to-face, but it doesn't get any better when people are not face-to-face. It actually gets worse, and that's the distance factor that I'll talk about, but I wanted to point that out, that at least when you're face-to-face, you have an opportunity to have a dialogue and clarify the meanings. So did culture play a role in this situation where the meanings didn't match? For sure. There was miscommunication. Why? Well, they did not have a chance to ask questions. Why? Because they did not want to sound stupid, and the American team was rushing. Now, why was this happening? Well, because the Chinese were trying to save face, which was more important to them, and the word yes was assumed by the Americans and the Germans as confirmation that everything was okay and that they understood everything. So at the bottom here, we see cultural programming differences are going to trigger different meanings, different understandings, and therefore people are going to do tasks different than the expectation. Another different dimension is called polychronic and monochronic. It's about the way people deal with time. Polychronic is coming from poly, which means many, monochronic from mono. And one way to explain that is that in typically monochronic people, like in Western linear thinking, people are going to plan their schedule. They're going to first do A, then they're going to do B, then they're going to do C, they're going to do D, etc. In a polychronic, many things are going to be done at once. So you have these circles here where you might start at A, but then jump to D. It's possible that you'll come out of the circle, do G, and so on and so forth. And we have to know that this is so because often the planning is impacting and the projects are going to be impacted when people are behaving that way. A simple example of this is a check-in counter at an airline. This is from a Lufthansa counter. It's a German airline. It's famous for being on time, but they're also famous for being very monochronic, which means one thing at a time. They take care of that customer, and until that customer is taken care of, they don't do the next. Now, this is from a situation in the Philippines. It's a polychronic situation. Only one person is flying. It's her. Everybody else is the cousin. They've all showed up to the airport to say goodbye, and the agent is trying to take care of business as well. So, people ask, what's the difference? What's better? It really depends on the situation. I just want to tell you that both airplanes took off on time simply because polychronic people and high context people usually have a lot of very good relationships. In this case, the relationship with the control tower, with the ground crew, with the maintenance crew, with the pilots, and both airplanes took off on time. So all of these dimensions don't point to one better than the other. You just have to know that there's contrast and keep that in mind. As far as distance goes, we're going to talk about time zones is one of the factors that impacts things. And time zones is really, the problem is availability. You know, why I say that is because if you see here the people on one side of the world, they're just starting their day. The people on the other side of the world have already worked 12 hours, 12 long hours, and are ready to go to sleep. And vice versa. Happened, you know, right away the next day. So you might have situations where you might not get a reply from somebody for 3 days. You know, it could be 3 days before you get a reply. And so you have to account for that, for the availability. Also, this is a problem. Availability is also about availability to listen to the expectation. And this is because we're multitasking. In this case, we have people sitting with thousands of miles in between. They are on these devices here trying to be clear. Well, at the same time, they're speaking on their cell phone, maybe texting, but they're also sending emails back and forth, sometimes unrelated. And with this multitasking, there's no way people can pay attention to what's going on and listening accurately. Also, you can't see the person in front of you. So if you hear, yes, no problem, then you might, you know, if you're not educated, you're gonna assume that there will be no problem. I would say after you listen to this, when you hear yes, you'll want to understand what that yes really means. This is a pie chart from some virtual phone conferences where we took some time studies and we found out that you know, the real productive time in this was about 60%. 40% was lost time, waiting, repeating. A lot of misunderstandings were happening on that virtual call. So this is just the types of things that you could do to keep track of these and build into your project plans for lessons learned. Another thing about distance is distrust. And you can realize there's distrust when you hear you guys, those guys, because it makes it about us versus them. And you know that that is a situation where there's going to be lack of trust. And without good trust and good relationships, your communication is going to suffer. You're going to have variation to your plan because of culture. And so you want to be careful about this situation. So recommendation is at kickoff, do the utmost possible. Have your face-to-face meeting. If you can't do that, form human relationships, you know, some kind of in a virtual way. Spend the time on your phone conferences or video conferences to establish human relationships, asking about what people like, about family, about sports, hobbies, and so on and so forth. And also team photos. You know, it's good to have the team photo of the colleagues that you're working with somewhere in your work area, so that even though it's a virtual, it might be a virtual project that you're managing, or virtual projects that you're managing, you have a relationship. You know that you're dealing with humans. And that's important because earlier I had a similar slide up that stated sender and receiver. If you note on this slide, I've changed it a little bit because communication is really not a mechanical process. It's a human process. And it's a process between a supplier and a customer. And because it's a human process, once we understand that, we take ownership, we take responsibility for clear communication from both ends, both the supplier when they're supplying information or requests, and from the customer when they're creating expectations. You have to have clear expectations in order to execute. So you have that responsibility. Now you have a human relationship between suppliers and customers. It's no longer transactional. It is relational, a relational type of communication. So communication is everyone's responsibility. The listeners, you, the listeners, and me, the presenter. It is everybody's responsibility. Now, I point out that things have accelerated, and real quick, I call this the paradox of the new shop floor, the new Gemba. We tend to interact fast to get things done quickly. The problem is things don't get done, they get done wrong, or they get done late. And then we have to speed up our interactions to recover the lost time, and then we're in this circle again. And this happens because time is money. And I always say invest time in relationships, in human relationships, and the money will come. And slow down to move fast. Slow down and form those relationships so that you can move fast. Now, this is a quote from Masaaki Imai. He is the author of Gemba Kaizen. He's also the founder and director of the Kaizen Institute. He brought Toyota Lean principles to the West. And he says quality begins when everybody in the organization commits to never sending rejects or imperfect information to the next process. Let me hijack that statement and say quality begins when every stakeholder commits to never sending imperfect information to the next process. The next process is your customer. And I think everybody likes to satisfy their customer. And so that is something that you should remember about information flow. Imperfect information is going to create problems. Jidoka is another way of looking at things. Jidoka is a Japanese term. It means automation with human intelligence, and it's about stopping work when a problem occurs immediately. That way, you are very close to the root cause of the problem, and you can find the root cause of the problem. In an operation like this is an assembly operation. You would have an operator finding a defect. They stop the line immediately, and they find a solution to the problem together. They Kaizen, they come together and do this. Now, what does this look like in a project? You have suppliers and customers, and they are sharing information and requests and instructions between each other. You have here a chain of customers to get to the goal of the project that you're managing. The minute there's a possibility of a misunderstanding, or when a misunderstanding occurs, you realize that the thought is not in common. Stop and take responsibility and look for the root cause, because then the solutions can be easier. It could take a dialogue, but you also want to find out why the misunderstanding occurred, because it's a learning opportunity. So you're going to have a dialogue until the meanings match, until the idea is clear and common. And better still, you want to stop everybody, Kaizen with everybody, because everybody can learn why the miscommunication happened and put it in your lessons learned standard. Because I know that a lot of project teams benefit from lessons learned and avoiding such things happening in the future. Now, getting toward the end of my presentation, I want to show you a few ways how PMO leaders can grasp, how to improve communication with the stakeholders. Again, going back to Dr. W.E. Deming, he talks about operational definitions. This is in a book called Out of the Crisis, where he outlines also his 14 famous steps. But I use this one. It's something that people often skip and don't pay attention to. But I think it has come of age. It's very important to give communicable meaning to a concept by specifying how the concept will be measured and applied in a specific set of circumstances. So I talked before about interoperability between systems and people. This is how people interact, and you have data sharing, you have design sharing, and you have people that have to communicate. And so you have to have that in your project very clear, that people and systems are going to operate together. So they have to have a standard way of communicating. Operational definitions establish a precise meaning to form a common language. It's a standard. It defines how a word should be applied in a specific context. And we're looking for something that's going to be communicable with the same meaning both to the supplier and the customer. Okay? Now, here are 3 examples: change request, reliable, and state-of-the-art. I can assure you that if I ask any of the people out there what a change request means, I'm going to get 5 different answers. Same thing with the word reliable. I mean, what is reliable? It's all relative to the circumstances and the context. And when I talk about state-of-the-art equipment, what does that mean? It could mean anything and many things. So, for example, I use that a lot because in the supply chains I've worked with, in the projects I've worked with, people send a change request. Some people take that as a request to proceed. Some people take that as a request for information before they proceed. And so you really have to have the operational definition to clarify what that change request means. You have to have a standard between people because they're each going to apply different meaning. It is the basis of the interoperability between the stakeholders of any project. So you'll want to adopt operational definitions across the enterprise. You want to remember this. You want to complement the skill sets of everybody participating, all the stakeholders, so that everybody improves their people skills. You want to take language, culture, and distance as potential contributors to variation to your project. And these are the key takeaways of my presentation today. I wanted to raise your awareness. I wanted to ensure that you take ownership and responsibility for these items, and especially for the communication that results. Bring variation to the surface, and you can use the root cause analysis system to do that, and adopt operational definitions to get rid of these three distance, culture, and language enemies of your project. With that, I thank you very much for listening today. Please join me on LinkedIn so that we can develop together better ways to improve our communication.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I had a great time listening to it, and I'm sure that all our viewers had the same experience, because when we talk about communication generally in the project management and PMO space, it means quite a different thing, right? And we're talking a lot about reporting, we're talking a lot about meetings, we're talking a lot about the required processes and tools. Communication, as you pointed out here, Sam, is a tool itself. And to get it right, there are multiple layers, beyond just the 5 whys. So thank you for talking to us about these 3 pillars, distance, culture, and learning, to make sure that we're communicating the right way. And I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions around this. So my first question to you here, Sam, is, okay, we've learned about these 3 pillars of communication now. How can we personally and consciously assess how good or bad we are at them, and then become better at them?
Right. Well, that's a good question, Hussein. I think, let me start with distance. If the stakeholders can't see each other, then assume that you're going to have issues, and or they don't know each other. It's the first time that the stakeholders are interacting. So, that already sends you the message that there's going to be distance between them. Not necessarily they have to be sitting kilometers apart or miles apart. They might be 50 feet away, and if they don't know each other, there is going to be that feeling distance that's going to create problems for execution. So you want to map out also, when you have, when you do have that physical distance, then the physical separation is also going to create issues. What you could do, or what we do often is we map out the relationship. So we start mapping out who already knows each other. That's always a benefit. You start from the benefit, people that have already worked together. Let's say in this case, the PMO has already worked together with some of the stakeholders, so that you already have a relationship. Knowing that is good, because you can place these people to help you form relationships with those that haven't worked together. And then you go to the worst case scenario, people that are really far away, time zone wise, and that those are the people you're going to have to pay special attention to with your communication, and between them and, between the PMO and them, and between them and the other stakeholders. So that's one thing that you want to look at. The other thing is, because you asked about assessments. I know of cultural assessments. I use cultural assessments, and I'm going to be launching and using some new assessments that I really liked, because they correlate the behaviors between 2 or more different national cultures. So you could, for example, you would go in there, and if you're Japanese, you can see how you would be received or perceived by somebody from the US. Or if you're from the Middle East, how are you going to be perceived by somebody from Germany? And so there are these cultural assessments, and people usually skip over these, but I think it's very important to add these to the PMO standard. And then language. And I think I touched on this a little bit. You'll want to assess the level of, so for example, English language of business that is often used in projects. also Mandarin in the Orient, Mandarin Chinese. But people say, well, I'm fluent in English. And it turns out that they're very fluent to order food at a restaurant or to order tickets for a bus. They're really not technically fluent. So you want to have some fluency tests and assessments that have language that is specific to the type of project your PMO is going to be dealing with. And so that, I hope that answers your question, Hussain.
Absolutely. Absolutely it does. Thank you, Sam. Sam, one thing that I wanted to ask you, obviously there are lots of challenges in large organizations or even small to mid-sized organizations. And I want to make sure that people are aware and conscious of that when a challenge is when they're about to get hit by a challenge, right? So my question to you is, what are the inhibitors that usually exist in, corporations and organizations that embrace this kind of communication that you are recommending and proposing, and what can we do about them?
Right. This is a very, very good question, Hassan. I get that. I get that a lot as well. Organizations, every organization is going to have their leadership. They're going to have their top management, and often I find that their top management is not trained to deal with these issues. They're not trained, and so they will delegate it to human resources. They'll delegate it to other functions, and when they do, things are not going to get taken care of properly. So the message there is the leadership really has to make an effort to understand that these are real issues, and make sure that they from the top start building this into their organization so that everybody else follows suit. That's one thing that I point out. Now, I realize it's difficult sometimes, these issues, because we spend most of our time dealing with physical. We like to deal with technology, we like to deal with equipment, because it's physical, you see it, you touch it. These are sometimes invisible and not tangible. And so in order to make it tangible, I always bring these things to the surface by using quality management tools, Ishikawa diagram, that root cause analysis type of thing, mapping things out. And so this is the type of stuff that that helps a lot. And finally, I'm working with somebody else on planning phase of a project to make this very visible. You could put this inside your FMEAs. You build this inside your FMEA, and you include that in your failure modes, where you can have miscommunication as a failure mode and different items that can cause it, like cultural language and distance, and start putting some risks on this. By doing that, you're bringing it to the surface, making sure that the whole organization is aware and starts dealing with these issues before they impact your project in a negative way. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Yes. Thank you, Sam. Sam, one final question for you. And I'm sure this happens in any regular conversation and communication, especially when you're having virtual teams, when you're having virtual communication. What can we do to make sure that we're ticking all the right check boxes for proper communication? Okay.
I know everybody wants the checklist.
Yes.
Well, actually, and in my latest book, in Walking the Invisible Gemba, I describe a 12-step process that actually takes it from the supplier and from the customer side. And that 12-step process, if you follow it, you would see the opportunities to improve your communication, to make sure that actually communication happens. I think that we don't have enough time to do this. If you'd like, when you're sending information out to the participants, I can add that to the slides. But it's in the book, and it explains it quite well. So that's, as far as a checklist, that's as close as I can get to your question. In the meantime, without a checklist, I would say never be afraid to double check assumptions. Remember, assume out loud means don't think that you understood, because that's going to create a problem. So you can always ask questions for clarification. How are you going to do this? When are you going to get it done? Who's going to help you? Really get there and ask questions. That's the type of thing you want to do. You want to dialogue. By the way, on virtual phone calls, this is a tip that I give to a lot of people that I train. In order to make sure that communication really happened, usually project teams, virtual project teams are going to have some kind of an open points list or a list of open points, depending on how you want to call it. And you don't want to have the same person build that list every time. Quite the opposite. What you want to do is randomly choose the person that has to put that open points list together. That way, everybody's going to be paying attention. They're all going to be asking questions to clarify whether they understood or not. By asking questions, everybody else is also going to understand. And so every time you have a meeting, change that person. That will make sure that everybody's really in tune with what's happening. By doing that, you make everybody responsible for communication. So as far as the steps, I would say the 12th step, I would recommend people look at that. It's a very simple process, but it would help. And then these other things that I just mentioned, Hussein. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely does. Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you once again for sharing all your knowledge, insights, and experience and bringing it to us at the PMO Virtual Summit.
My pleasure. Thanks again for the invitation. And I hope to add value to the participants.
For sure, Sam, for sure. And for all the listeners and viewers out there, if you want to learn more about Sam, see what he does, and get access to all the books that he's written, please visit his website at samyankelevitch.com. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sam. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hussein. Bye.